Silver screen above. Keys beneath hum soft and low. Quiet worlds collide. Here is how I put my PSP on my keyboard. I may have mentioned this on my channel before, but one of the hobbies that I picked up in 2023 was language learning. I've been studying Japanese on my own for around a year now, which is kind of crazy to think about, though I've been going at a slow and steady pace. For context, I know 3 languages other than English and Japanese, and I'm only really good at one of them. I speak poor Chinese, even poorer Korean, and I'm fluent in... My Chinese and Korean abilities are another level of bad. In Chinese, I can't really read or write, and my Korean listening ability is just... My poor language ability was something that I started to get more unhappy about as I got older, because I spent so much of my youth in Chinese class and also Korean class in college, and I felt like since I wasn't taking things seriously, I just wasted a lot of that time, and now I suck at both of them. So a few months before my trip to Japan earlier this year, which I talked about in my video about building a tiny Japanese vending machine, I made it my mission to become, or try to become, fluent in Japanese eventually. Now, you might be wondering why Japanese and not one of the other languages that you already started. Well, I felt like starting from scratch and choosing a new language completely that I haven't taken any classes in would be a way for me to prove to myself that I am able to achieve fluency on my own through just self-study. Also, Korean, Chinese, and do help with learning Japanese to some extent, because Japanese uses Chinese characters, has a particle system very similar to Korean, and they made... So it wouldn't be a complete waste of the classes that I took before. At this point, you're probably like, who cares about language study? Where's the PSP? Where's the keyboard? Hold on, I'm getting there. I started out studying Japanese through some elementary level textbooks, and it worked at first, but very quickly my ADHD started to take over. I found it very difficult to concentrate, and I was already losing motivation to study just within a few weeks, which is the exact same sequence of events that I experienced when trying to learn the other languages that I barely know. It was at this point that I ran into a channel called Gengo. For those of you not familiar with Matt, he is a freaking legend that teaches people how to learn Japanese by immersing themselves in video games. Immersion learning is a way of learning a language where you immerse into the target language by either consuming as much content in the language as possible, or actually just going to the country and speaking with people in the language. But it's very effective, and it's a lot more fun than just going through textbooks. As a disclaimer, I have absolutely zero affiliation with the Gengo YouTube channel. I'm not sponsored by them. I don't know Matt personally, none of that. I just stumbled upon his channel, and I wanted to learn Japanese, and I like video games. I guess that's not a really surprising combination of things. After watching a bunch of Matt's videos, it really motivated me to start employing video game-based immersion learning into my studying routine. And I was super excited to actually hop in and start playing some games in Japanese. So that led me to my next question, which was, what console do I play on? Personally, I've been a Nintendo one-trick gamer for most of my life. I've owned a Game Boy SP, Nintendo DS, a 3DS, a Wii, not the Wii U because it's shit, a Switch, and a Switch OLED. So a bunch of consoles, and I pretty much only played Nintendo for most of my life. However, as a kid, there was one console that I really wanted that I never got, and it was actually by a different company that we know called Sony. This console was the PlayStation Portable, the PSP. I remember being really mesmerized by the PSP design back when I was a kid, and even looking at it now, I still think it was probably way ahead of its time. On top of that, it's really compact, and it's even smaller than the Switch Lite, and it also has a bunch of JRPG titles where I could probably learn a bunch of Japanese through dialogue in these games. So I thought it was a perfect fit for this use case. So with that said, I bought this baby on eBay for like $100, and I've been playing it for a while now, and I've really enjoyed the experience. It's made learning Japanese a much more fun and engaging process. My study sessions generally look something like this. I'll have my PSP out, I'll be playing a game, and on the side, I'll have my computer loaded with my note-taking app and language translation app, both next to each other, and I'll just play the game. And whenever I run into a word or phrase that I don't know, I'll look it up, take a note, and then convert it into a flashcard at the end of my session. And that's kind of the whole flow of how I've been doing this. This flow works really well, so much so that my PSP is pretty much always next to my computer. However, it's a bit awkward when I run into a phrase or word I don't know and I want to put my PSP somewhere so that I can actually go and take the note, do lookups and things like that. I usually just put it flat on the table in front of me, and then that requires that I kind of like do this strange head maneuver that makes me look kind of dumb, and it's also very uncomfortable. So that's where I got the idea for today's video. I wanted to make something that would allow me to place my PSP in a comfortable position while I'm studying so that I can take notes without breaking my neck. I apologize for the very long-winded story this time, but this is a problem that affects me a lot because I study every day and this has been a constantly recurring issue. So I'm really excited for us to actually get started with the solution. So let's hop into the build. I thought through a couple of options for this project. The first one was hanging my PSP on my computer screen somewhere for maximum visibility. However, I was worried this would damage my very expensive laptop screen somehow, so I eventually decided against this. I could also suspend it over my laptop keys somehow, since I use an external keyboard anyways, so that space is just kind of useless. However, I eventually also thought this was kind of a convoluted solution and probably wasn't worth it for a V1. Eventually, I decided to go with a somewhat simple design inspired by keyboards nowadays that have a tilted screen on them. That's right, we have screens on cars, refrigerators, and now we got them on keyboards. With that said, I didn't really know how comfortable the viewing angles would be here. It's a bit low compared to what I was initially thinking, but it's such a simple solution that I thought it was a shame to not just try it out. The general idea I came up with is that I wanted to take my existing keyboard, create some kind of frame around it where I could house the actual keyboard itself, and then also have some stand where the PSP would go. So now that I had the concept in my head, it was time to get it out of there and onto the computer. I started out by measuring my keyboard and designing a frame around it in the perimeter so that it had a slot for the keyboard and also one at the bottom for a nice plump wrist rest, which I always recommend using, by the way. You can't have your wrist typing like this and be getting that caramel tunnel or whatever and not being able to use the computer anymore, because what else are we going to do with our lives? For my PSP, I designed a very simple slot at the top that would just hold the PSP up at a very comfortable viewing angle for maximum comfort. It's just a stand. It's not that complicated. Once I had the frame all catted up, I wanted to 3D print a prototype so that I could test fit everything and make sure I didn't mess up the measurements. Now, as you might know from my AI trash can video, I don't really have a large 3D printer at home, so I'm going to have to break this thing up into multiple parts, and that's what I did. So I separated them out in Fusion 360, printed them separately, and then glued them together. This process made the thing look really ugly and super flimsy. With the trash can, the gluing didn't make it as flimsy because the parts were generally speaking pretty thick, but here they're really thin because I was trying to save on material, and it just makes the whole thing look really ugly. But it's just a prototype, so that's fine. After letting the Gorilla Glue dry, I put my keyboard into the slot, I put the wrist rest in, and finally the PSP. And overall, it looks like I didn't really mess up any of the measurements too bad. I did have to make some slight adjustments here and there, but on the whole, everything looked good. Now that I was done prototyping, it was time to make the real thing. For the actual finalized version, I wanted something that was in one piece that wasn't glued together, simply because this is something that I'm going to be using every day, and I'm going to be looking at every day, and I want to be proud of it, and I want it to look nice. So I decided to call up our good friends at PCBway to help us get an actual finalized version printed in one piece with their big 3D printers. PCBway is your one-stop shop for anything PCB manufacturing or assembly. They have a variety of different services, including PCB manufacturing, 3D printing, and CNC. And we've used a lot of these different offerings on various videos on this channel. For this video, I'm once again going to be using their 3D printing services because my printer is small, and PCBway has the ability to make this giant print in one piece, which is great because I don't want to use my Gorilla Glued piece of shiitake mushroom all the time. I want to use one that's uniform and nice. Luckily for me, PCBway does have big boy printers, and they were able to get this part printed so quickly, stress-free, and delivered straight to my house from China. All I had to do was upload the STL, have the file reviewed by their engineers real quick, And within a few weeks, I ended up with this package at my doorstep. One interesting thing about this print is that it's printed in nylon, which I usually don't print with, but it has some pretty strong structural properties and is a bit more tough than PLA, which I usually use. This is great because my keyboard is heavy and I also tend to type with tremendous amounts of force per keystroke, so this would be able to hold up to that. The part itself is really beautiful and a lot more detailed and smooth than the parts that I print at home. So I highly recommend PCBway for any of your 3D printing needs. Even if you have a 3D printer already, PCBway is very useful when you have these kind of one-off requirements like this, where you may need really large parts or some kind of special material. So I'd highly recommend you check them out in the description below. Shout out to PCBway. Now that our homies at PCBway have helped us manufacture this part, all I had to do was place my keyboard in, place my wrist rest in, and place my PSP in, and bam, we're done with this project. So I've been using this setup for a few days now, and it's mostly been pretty good. It definitely feels a lot less awkward having a place to put my PSP whenever I need to bust out the note-taking app or ChatGPT in the middle of a game. Do you guys see this? I'm being attacked by a ray of light. It's as if I'm being scanned by a copy machine. With that said, I think the design could have benefited from some more elevation in the PSP stand itself. So right now, I place my laptop on a stand of its own, and because of that, the screen is relatively high up. So now that my PSP is sitting at an angle, it is more comfortable for me to look at, but I still do need to do this kind of head bobbing motion. Look at screen to see the looked up word, go back down to read the context, look back up, go back down, look up. It's just like a very still like a kind of tedious process in that sense, and that my neck is still working, just not as hard. So I definitely think in the future, maybe I'd benefit from re-exploring the idea of potentially mounting it to the screen somehow so that I could just stare at that one position and not have to do these kind of neck gymnastics, so to speak. In addition, it kind of blocks my trackpad right now, which isn't an issue in my normal desktop setup, but in my current laptop setup, this is quite annoying. But it's an issue that's very easily solved just by using a mouse. None of these downsides were really huge to me, so overall I would say this project is still a net win. But in the future, I'll definitely revisit that idea of mounting my PSP to my laptop screen. I definitely think that's probably going to end up being the most comfortable solution in the end. I'm trying to avoid this beam of light right now, so excuse me for hiding in the corner over here. So yeah, that's how I put my PSP on my keyboard. And I'm aware that this is a really niche and specific problem. There's not much financial incentive for companies in 2024 to create PSP stands on laptops or keyboards for language learning. But because we're makers and we're smartly stupid, we're able to make things like this happen, even when they don't make sense. Thank you so much for watching, and special shout out to PCBway for sponsoring this video. As you can tell, I'm not in my usual spot right now, but they were still able to get this part shipped over to me so I can make this video. So very appreciative of that. If you want to see more weird and quirky builds like this, subscribe to the channel and go out there and build things that don't make sense. Pear out.